If you look at human history, we're really the only species that can build a prison or, a sanctuary or a battlefield completely out of thin air.
Yeah, using nothing but, like, agreed upon sequences of sounds.
Exactly. And I mean, we tend to visualize society as physical infrastructure, right? You
Mhm.
picture the courthouse, the Capitol building, the border wall.
Sure, the concrete and the steel.
Right, but those are just the after effects. The actual, the load-bearing structures of human civilization are words.
It's literally the operating code of human organization.
Yeah.
I mean, before a single brick is laid or a border is drawn, the architecture has to be uh, spoken into existence.
Which brings us to the source material we're diving into for you today,
Right.
because this isn't some sprawling historical text
No, no.
or like a dense academic thesis. We have this master list of exactly 58 words.
Just 58.
Yeah, categorized simply as the vocabulary of government, law, and society. And at first glance, I mean, it looks like a study sheet for a high school civics test.
It really does. It appears deceptively mundane. But when you examine these 58 specific terms, you aren't just looking at dictionary definitions.
Right.
You're looking at the actual schematic for how humans engineer power. How we manufacture compliance and the mechanisms we use to stop ourselves from just tearing each other apart.
So in this deep dive, we're going to deconstruct how these words actually manipulate human behavior at scale. Because before a society can have laws or build those courthouses, it has to define itself, right?
It has to draw a circle around a concept and declare that it exists.
Exactly. It's like building a house. You start by pouring the foundation.
Yeah.
And our list begins with this vocabulary of creation, words like constitute, entity, incorporate, infrastructure.
Ministry, regulate, legislate, regime.
Yeah. So let's look at incorporate. Because when you constitute an entity, you're building that foundation.
Well, consider the psychological weight of a word like incorporate, right? The etymology traces back to the Latin corpus, meaning body. So when a society decides to incorporate an entity, it's engaging in a kind of legal alchemy.
Legal alchemy. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, because it takes an abstract idea like a business, a town, a government agency, and grants it a fictional legal body.
Right. This invisible entity that can now own property.
Exactly.
Right.
It can own property, it can be sued, it can outlive its human founders.
Yeah.
We have mutually agreed to basically hallucinate its physical existence.
It's entirely a consensual hallucination, but once that abstract body is created, it needs like a nervous system to direct it, right? The physical and bureaucratic infrastructure, the walls and the plumbing of our house analogy.
Which brings us to how these words mask the actual application of power.
Yes, because looking at this specific block of words, two stand out in really sharp contrast to me. Ministry and regime.
Oh, that's a perfect contrast.
Because technically, I mean, in dictionary terms, they describe the same thing, right? They both
Yeah.
refer to the administration in charge, the people pulling the levers. But the emotional resonance is, well, it couldn't be more different.
The divergence there reveals how language is weaponized to engineer public perception. I mean, the word ministry comes from roots meaning service, or a lesser person, like a servant.
Wait, really? A servant?
Yeah. So when a government labels its power centers as ministries, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Transportation, it's deploying bureaucratic camouflage.
Right.
The language implies this quiet, boring efficiency. It sounds like, people in gray suits just filing paperwork for your benefit.
It sounds totally harmless. Like you don't rebel against a ministry. You just wait in line for them to stamp your form.
Exactly. But then you look at regime.
Right.
It stems from regere, to rule or to direct. When a government is described as a regime, the camouflage is completely stripped away.
It implies heavy-handed authority.
It does. But the underlying power structure, the physical capability to force you to do something, might be exactly the same in a ministry as it is in a regime.
So the vocabulary just dictates whether the power is being framed as like a service you requested or a force being imposed upon you. So a ministry fixes the potholes so you can drive, but a regime dictates whether you're even allowed to own a car.
That's the framing of the boundary, yes.
And boundaries are the entire point of the next phase of this societal blueprint, because once the infrastructure is built, the system has to manage the actual humans operating inside it.
Right. We transition to the words of social control,
which are norm, conform, constrain, prohibit, restrict, violate, cease.
Notice how this sequence moves from invisible influence to physical force.
I do, but I've got to push back a little here. Because I look at this list and I see an overwhelmingly negative framework.
How so?
It's an entire vocabulary dedicated to stopping human action, like constrain the individual, prohibit their choices, restrict their movement, force their actions to cease. Is society just one giant do not touch sign? It paints a picture of this massive apparatus designed solely to suppress our instincts.
Well, you're viewing those words from the perspective of the individual encountering friction, which is natural.
Yeah.
But from a systems engineering perspective, it's actually a mechanism of efficiency. The system relies primarily on the first two words in that list you read.
Norm and conform.
Right. A norm is honestly the most efficient form of behavioral control ever invented because it requires zero funding.
It's zero funding.
Think about it. It requires no police, no judges, no prisons. The population just polices itself through social pressure.
Oh, like the unspoken agreement that we all face forward in an elevator.
Exactly. Or that we wear clothes in public. The system prefers that you conform to the norm because it costs the state absolutely nothing.
Right, so the negative vocabulary, prohibit, constrain, cease, that only kicks in when the cheap control fails.
Yes, when the invisible control of the norm fails.
Yeah.
Because the heavy machinery of the law is incredibly expensive and slow. I mean, prohibiting behavior requires constant surveillance and enforcement.
But wait, framing norms as this efficient, harmless baseline kind of assumes the norms themselves are inherently good, or at least neutral.
That's true.
And a norm isn't necessarily a moral good, right? It's just a statistical majority. Throughout history, societies have established deeply oppressive norms. So if the norm is exclusionary or discriminatory, then demanding people conform is just tyrannical.
You're absolutely right, but here's the thing. The vocabulary of the system doesn't concern itself with morality.
It doesn't.
No, it concerns itself with stability. You're talking about justice, which is vital, but these foundational words are describing structural integrity.
Okay, I see.
When someone steps outside the established norm, whether they're, a visionary fighting for civil rights or a thief breaking into a home, the system registers the exact same thing.
A disruption.
Exactly. A disruption. The person has chosen to violate the structure.
So the system's immediate reflex is just to eliminate the disruption.
Its reflex is to force the behavior to cease. It uses constrain and prohibit as essentially tourniquets to stop the bleeding of established order.
Wow. Okay, but that assumes the disruption is just a single outlier. But humans don't just bump up against the system, right? We bump up against each other constantly.
Friction is guaranteed.
Exactly, which forces us into the vocabulary of the breakdown. Because when people refuse to conform, the society needs a highly specific, managed process for dealing with the fallout.
The machinery of conflict resolution. Look at the progression of the terms we have here.
Let me read them. Conflict, contradict, contrary, controversy, convene, confer, mediate, intervene, invoke, compensate.
Right.
It reads like instructions for an algorithmic cooling mechanism or a structured therapy session for an entire population.
That's a great analogy.
It takes raw human emotion and forces it through this very narrow, sterile pipe. We start with the spark. People hold contrary views. Someone decides to contradict an established fact.
And that public friction creates a controversy.
Right. And when it boils over, it becomes a conflict. Historically, before this vocabulary existed, a conflict ended with whoever had the biggest rock.
Right. It ended in blood feuds, a cycle of violence that could, destabilize an entire region for generations.
So instead of violence, this vocabulary forces the parties into this highly choreographed delay. It requires the people in conflict to convene, to physically occupy the same space and confer.
They have to use language.
Yes, but because humans in conflict are rarely capable of solving it themselves, the law requires that a neutral third party intervene to mediate.
Notice the temperature of the words in that process.
The temperature.
Yeah. Human conflict is chaotic, it's loud, it's irrational, it's deeply personal. But words like convene, confer, and mediate are profoundly sterile.
Oh, I see what you mean.
They act as a psychological heat sink. The law forces individuals to translate their personal outrage into procedural terminology. You aren't screaming at your neighbor on the lawn. Your attorney is invoking a statute in a courtroom.
The abstraction is the point. You literally remove the visceral anger by wrapping it in paperwork.
Precisely. And look at the final word in that sequence, compensate. The goal of this vast legal machinery isn't actually forgiveness. The state doesn't care if the parties hate each other for the rest of their lives.
They really don't.
The objective is to assign a measurable, often financial value to the grievance and compensate the injured party. It replaces the infinite loop of revenge with a finalized transaction.
So once compensation is paid, the system just considers the order restored.
Completely, regardless of the emotional reality.
Man, assigning a dollar value to a grievance is such an artificial fiction, but it's a necessary one to keep the structure standing, which honestly forces a transition to the most unstable part of this entire blueprint.
A human element.
Yes, we're talking about structures and systems keeping order, but human beings are operating those systems. And the vocabulary list has a dedicated section exposing the ethical vulnerabilities of the people holding the power.
It's the tension between human flaws and societal ideals.
Exactly. Because we have this cluster of deeply predatory words on the list: bias, discriminate, exclude, exploit, ignorant, and they're placed in direct opposition to the words of structural defense: integrity, neutral, mutual, consent, advocate, justify, expose.
Right, because the law is an incredibly powerful tool, but it's ultimately agnostic.
Agnostic.
Yeah, I mean, a legal framework can be used to protect a minority population, or it can be used to legally exploit and discriminate against them. The vocabulary of power contains both the sickness and the cure.
Which brings up a really probing question for you listening. Can a government or law ever truly be neutral? I mean, our list includes the word bias, and it also includes the word integral. Is bias simply an integral component of any human architecture?
It's a fundamental question.
Like, we build the system, so our blind spots and prejudices are just baked into the concrete.
Well, the inclusion of words like advocate and expose in the foundational vocabulary suggests that the architects of society know the system is inherently flawed.
They built in an alarm system.
Exactly. If the system were perfectly neutral and operated with absolute integrity, you wouldn't need a vocabulary dedicated to exposing its failures. The law exists, in theory, to prevent those in power from being ignorant of the marginalized.
Or using their leverage to exclude them.
Right.
But the law itself is often the instrument of exclusion. It creates the norms we discussed earlier.
Which is exactly why the counter vocabulary is so critical. A functional society relies on mutual consent. When the system begins to discriminate, the societal structure depends on individuals who are willing to advocate for the vulnerable.
And expose the corruption.
Yes. The system must constantly be forced to justify its actions. These words operate as the societal immune system. They acknowledge that the structure will inevitably rot from the inside out due to human bias, and it requires constant, active intervention to maintain its integrity.
It's like an endless game of structural whack-a-mole. The system builds a rule, the rule gets exploited, an advocate exposes the exploitation, the system justifies a change, and the cycle just starts all over again.
Which proves that human society is never a finished product. It's a continuous, unstable negotiation.
And that negotiation requires energy. I mean, we've mapped out how the society builds its framework, how it cools down conflict, and how it battles its own ethical rot. But, on a Tuesday morning, the system still needs the trash collected.
The fields harvested.
Exactly. The microchips manufactured. It needs human energy to function day to day.
Which brings us to the final category on our master list, the levers of action.
The economic engine.
Right. We're looking at the words incentive, induce, levy, subsidy, labor, grant, welfare, eliminate, initiate. Because telling a population what they are prohibited from doing doesn't actually build a bridge.
No, it doesn't.
You have to route human behavior toward productive outcomes.
Yeah.
It's like driving a car using carrots and sticks.
I look at this vocabulary as a system of fluid dynamics.
Okay, fluid dynamics. How so?
Well, human effort and capital flow like water, right? Usually taking the path of least resistance. A government's job is to engineer that landscape so the water flows where the society needs it most. Ah, I see. So if the government wants to initiate something good, say researching renewable energy or building affordable housing, they push the subsidy or grant pedal. That's the carrot.
Exactly. They dig a channel to make that path incredibly easy. That channel is the subsidy. It creates an incentive. It financially induces the population to pour their energy into that specific direction because the friction has been artificially lowered.
That makes total sense. And the counter mechanism is just as vital. If they want to eliminate something bad, like excessive pollution, they pull the levy brake. That's the stick.
Right. They don't necessarily prohibit it because, as we said, prohibition is expensive to enforce. Instead, they build a dam. They introduce a levy.
By increasing the taxes or the fees, the state increases the friction. It makes the water flow somewhere else.
And this is the invisible architecture of daily life. This is where the abstract ideas hit your wallet. The system manipulates variables to shape collective behavior, and most individuals never even realize their choices have been engineered.
Yeah, but the core of this economic section rests on two heavily loaded words: labor and welfare.
The ultimate transactional loop.
Right.
Because labor is not just a job. In the vocabulary of societal structure, labor is the extraction of human time, intellect, and physical energy to power the system. It is the literal fuel.
And welfare.
Well, stripping away modern political connotations and looking strictly at its dictionary function, welfare is the recirculation of that energy.
It's the system ensuring it doesn't consume its own foundation.
Exactly the point.
Yeah.
This is the fundamental economic contract between the state and the individual. If a system extracts labor indefinitely without maintaining the well-being, the welfare of the population providing that fuel, the engine eventually seizes.
The structure collapses under the weight of its own inequality.
Yes. The tension between how much labor is extracted and how much welfare is provided is the defining economic negotiation of absolutely any civilization.
You know, you really start to view the world differently when you break it down to these base components.
Yeah.
It's no longer just politicians arguing on television or judges hitting gavels. It is a highly calculated manipulation of incentives, levies, and norms. We started today with 58 words on a page, a simple vocabulary list. But tracing them through reveals the complete, invisible blueprint of modern civilization.
We observed how humans constitute an entity from nothing, creating a fiction we all agree to live inside. We examined the bureaucratic shield of the ministry, masking the force of the regime.
We dissected how society demands we conform to norms, deploying constrain and prohibit only when the cheap mechanism of social pressure fails. We mapped the sterile algorithmic pipe of the legal system, forcing raw conflict into a room to confer, mediate, and ultimately compensate.
We analyzed the ongoing battle within the system's immune system, the constant requirement to advocate and expose the inherent bias and exploitation that humans bring to any structure, and a desperate attempt to maintain integrity.
And finally, we looked at the fluid dynamics of the economic engine. The subsidies that induce behavior, the levies that eliminate it, and the fundamental exchange of human labor for societal welfare. I mean, it is the complete source code.
But source code requires updates.
Right.
Language is never static because the human condition is never static. We invented words like incorporate and legislate to solve the problems of past centuries. But we are now facing entirely new categories of challenges: global digital networks, artificial intelligence, planetary climate shifts.
The structures we built with these 58 words are buckling under the weight of realities they were never designed to handle.
So consider the world we're stepping into. If you possess the authority to amend this foundational master list, if you could engineer one completely new word, a new concept, into the structural blueprint of human society to address the reality of tomorrow, what word is missing from the foundation?
That is the question to take with you. The architecture is invisible, but it is built entirely out of the language we agree to use. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the structures around you. We'll see you next time.